In 2008, Steve Jobs introduced the world to the iPhone. But this wasn't just any ordinary product launch. It was a masterclass in storytelling. And I don't mean he had characters and suspenseful moments and all the other typical things we think of when we think of stories. I mean, he was able to get a room full of people to care about what he was saying for 80 straight minutes. And this kicked off a new era for Apple. They would forever be different after this presentation. But what was it about this presentation that was so special? And how do you give a good presentation to get the audience to care? Well, I wanted to figure this out myself. So over the last few months, I went through every iconic presentation I could think of. And after analyzing the structure and the content and the format of all these presentations, I came across something really interesting. Turns out, almost every single one of these does the same three things. The first thing these presenters all have in common is a great introduction. And I don't just mean they introduced the topic. I mean, they were able to get the audience to care about what they were saying. That's what an introduction does. Help the audience understand why what you have to say is important. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do this, but the method I like to follow, especially for slide-based communication, is the SCQA framework, which just stands for situation, complication, question, and answer. And if you look really closely, Steve Jobs actually follows this really well. He starts by explaining how Apple has continued to revolutionize the tech industry, first with the Mac, but then later with the iPod. Then he talks about the mobile phone industry and how there's a noticeable lack of innovation. There's a lot of smartphones out there, but they're clunky and ugly with rigid keyboards and a lack of good software. So this is the problem. This is the complication. Then he poses his question. What if we could take the innovation that Apple's known for and apply it to the smartphone industry? And of course, the answer is the iPhone. Right in the beginning of his presentation, he structures exactly why you should care about this presentation. There's a lot of smartphones out there, but they're not that smart, and we're going to solve that problem. By the time the audience gets to this moment, they're completely locked into what he's saying. That's because Jobs hasn't sold them on features. He told them a story, and they want to see how that story unfolds. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's great for Steve Jobs, but I'm just trying to build a deck that my boss is happy with. Well, you can do that too, whether you're building slides or preparing for an actual speech. Here's an example from BCG and Google about digital spending in India. And they follow the same exact framework. They start out by explaining the situation. Digital spending has been on the rise in India, powered by things like smartphone prices, data tariffs, and mobile-first content. And then that sets up the problem or the complication, which is that digital spending in India is still evolving and has a lot of room for growth. So then the big question to be answered is, how can companies enable this growth? And this introduction sets up the rest of the presentation so that the audience actually cares about the information they have to share. And each slide provides specific recommendations for capitalizing on this digital growth opportunity. Now, taking a step back, notice what this introduction does, or what any introduction does. It tells your audience why the information you're sharing is important, what's in it for them. Instead of just jumping into recommendations, they put those recommendations in context, and it helps the audience identify why they matter. The second thing I've noticed with most of these iconic presentations is that they get straight to the big idea and then go into the details. Let me show you what I mean. You might remember this really famous TED Talk from Sinek, How Great Leaders Inspire Action. The whole talk is 18 minutes long, but at 1 minute and 49 seconds, he tells us his main idea, which he calls the golden circle. The basic idea is this. Companies should start with their why, then communicate their how, then communicate the what. Because people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And only after he introduces this idea does he go into the detail. First, he talks about how Apple believes in challenging the status quo, which is their why. Then the second example is he talks about how our brains are wired for starting with why. Because we have a neocortex that's responsible for our rational thought, but what controls our decisions is our limbic brain, which is responsible for our feelings. So by communicating the why instead of the what, companies can appeal to their consumers' feelings and convince them to believe what they believe. This is point number 2. And then he goes on to point number 3. He talks about how the Wright brothers were able to figure out flight before other well-capitalized and well-connected investors because they were driven by a cause, a purpose, a belief. So he starts with this main idea and then goes into the detail with 3 examples. Imagine if he would have gone into the details first, talking about our brains and Apple and the Wright brothers, and then tried to make his point at the end. It would have been a lot less persuasive and a lot less interesting, maybe a little harder to follow. In a slide-based presentation, you could do this practically by having a slide at the very beginning that introduces the main point you're trying to communicate. And a good way to do this is to think about what you want your audience to believe after they've seen your presentation. Make a slide about that in the beginning, and then the rest of the presentation is just details and support. On this channel, we talk a lot about the pyramid principle, which is basically this same idea. Start with your main point, follow that up with your supporting arguments, and then go into the details and data. If you're interested in learning more about how to do this, we got a bunch of videos on this topic. I'll link them down below. The last thing I've noticed is that all of these presentations have defining moments. Some point in the presentation where the speaker's message really gets driven home. So how do you create these kind of defining moments for your presentations? Well, it's really not that hard. Number one, make sure you keep it simple. This is why sound bites can be so effective. Like this iconic clip from Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
The whole speech is incredible, but this moment in particular really landed with the audience, and it got everyone excited. It's a pretty effective statement, in part because of how simple and how clear it is. Number two, make sure it matters. Defining moments don't really mean much if they aren't connected to your overarching message. Remember, think about what you want your audience to believe and why they should care. Your soundbite or your visual or whatever your defining moment is should connect to this overarching message. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher gave this iconic speech to members of her own Conservative Party. At the time, the UK was facing really high inflation, and she was getting a lot of criticism about her economic policies. And the critics were telling her she needs to reverse course, she needs to make a U-turn. So she drops the iconic line, "The lady's not for turning." The main point of her speech was to tell her party, her critics, and everyone else that she would not be swayed. And this was a defining moment. The last way to create defining moments is to use visuals. There's something about visuals that really pack a punch. They create impact. People believe visuals. In a presentation, a chart works really well for this. You can also use diagrams or infographics, all sorts of options here. Think back to the iPhone presentation. He frames the initial problem by showing us visually how most smartphones are not easy to use and actually not that smart. And you can tell from the video that the audience was really focused on this point. There's something about showing something visually, even if you made up the data behind it, that can be really compelling. So now that you've learned some key aspects about how to deliver a persuasive presentation, you might like this video right here where we talk about how consulting firms use a lot of these same principles to structure and design their presentations from start to finish.